So a while ago, a brand new controller was announced that has compatibility with the Nintendo Switch, and I was pretty interested in it. So I waited a little bit to see some of the first words, and then I decided to buy it, and here it is. This is the 8bitdo SN30 Pro Plus Bluetooth gamepad. So this actually works with the Switch, Windows, Mac, Android, and Raspberry Pi. But today I'm actually going to be strictly focusing on its compatibility with the Nintendo Switch, as me and probably a lot of the people watching this are probably going to exclusively use it for their Nintendo Switch. So let's actually just take a look at the controller itself. So here it is. In the box it comes with this and a charging cable for it, so you can use it to charge it and then connect it to your PC as well. As for the controller itself, its design is very reminiscent of a PS3 controller, which I have here, mixed with a bit of a Super Nintendo controller, which I have here as well. So the dual analog stick is very similar to the DualShock design, and the D-pads and the face buttons remind me a lot of the Super Nintendo. And that's I mean, I really like the design. The design itself is really good, and I like how big the controller is, as I've got relatively big hands, so using something like the Joy-Con here has never really been an option for me because I've got so big of hands that I could crush this thing without even thinking. And who wants to use a controller that they could easily destroy? Not me, that's who. So, yeah, the controller itself is very nice. The buttons are of high quality, the analog sticks are pretty high quality, and the D-pad itself feels really nice. The only thing I could really compare the D-pad to is maybe a mix of the Super Nintendo's D-pad and the Nintendo 64's D-pad. The 64's D-pad and the response that the D-pad itself, like just moving it around feels the same as it, but its responsiveness, like the clicking and moving of the D-pad itself, feels very much like a Super Nintendo controller. The sticks I feel like are of higher quality than the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, and the buttons themselves feel nice and responsive. The L and R buttons are that feel like Super Nintendo as well, and then of course the triggers here are obviously not of any sort of. They're not very similar to the PS3 controllers sticks or triggers. They feel kind of like a PS4 controller triggers. But anyway, yeah, so it also has a different start and select button, and then it has a star and a heart button on the controller as well. So enough looking at the controller, let's get right into using the software for it. And I highly suggest using the software before you do anything else. Now, I highly recommend connecting this to your computer before you start using it with anything. Mostly because when I started doing it, and the first thing I did with this controller was plug it into my Switch and start playing with it. And that's when I noticed an insane amount of latency, probably even close to a full second of it between inputs and motion and anything like that from my Switch. And so my first fear was that I had gotten a broken version of it, but turns out it was just because I needed to connect it and update it, because the controller itself has its own firmware. You're offered a program that you can use to edit and modify the controller, as this controller itself is completely customizable, and that is one of its selling points. So once the program shows up, and you can see here that you can change between switch mode and X input mode. The switch mode is probably what I'm just going to be leaving it on, and I imagine most people watching this are probably going to leave it on this. But you can switch it to X input if you're planning to use it on a computer. And then here it shows you what each of the buttons correspond to. So here's in the switch mode, it shows me what each button corresponds to. Like this little button here, the little heart represents the home button, and the little star is the capture button. So from here, you can go and change things like the stick sensitivity. So here it shows you the dead zone of the sticks, and here you can actually change it, so you can basically modify what is considered a full tilt. So I can make it to where a small change of the controller is suddenly registered as a full tilt instead of having to completely tilt the stick. So instead of having to go full, I can make it to where only like half of the stick needs to be moved forward to be considered, fully holding the stick in a direction. You can do that with both sticks as well. So if you have a better preference, or you just want to not wear out the sticks as much, you can modify that as well. You can do the same with the triggers to change how much is required for it to be considered a full press of the trigger. This, I could see this being a little bit useful, as I didn't really show it off very well in the looking at the controller, but the little triggers actually require more of a press than any other the triggers for the Switch. Any other controller doesn't require as much of a press on the trigger as these do. So I expect some people to maybe want to mess with this to change how much they will have to press down on it for it to work. And then you can also change the vibration. As you can see, I already have it completely disabled because I'm not really a fan of vibration on the controller. And then another thing you can do, and I'm not going to do this because I don't play anything where this is going to be relevant, but you can also set macros. So you can set a chain of inputs to occur by doing something. So if you can completely add just random inputs, and so if you're playing like a game, like a fighting game or something where it has inputs, like an insane amount of inputs, you can map this sort of input chain into something. Now, of course, I have no real use for this, so I'm not going to ever really bother with this, but it's there if you want to. And like I said, you can also completely remap the controls here in the main screen, so you can modify what each of this does. Now, I'm probably going to actually do this myself for Splatoon, because the primary way to use your special in Splatoon is to click in on the right stick, or the R3 button. And it's not a whole lot of fun, and I've never enjoyed that. So I would probably modify the R3 button to be the L button, because the L button doesn't normally get used in gameplay in Splatoon 2. So I would remap the R3 button to the L1 button instead in this case. So I'd click here and just completely change it. So now R3 equals L1. And then I can press the sync to controller to set that as the new standard on the controller. So yeah, you can completely remap things to change up how the controller functions if you have a more preferred way of playing. It sort of gives you the same sort of customization you could expect in Super Smash Bros. So you can change it to how you like to play, and so on. So now that we're done looking at the software, let's actually just go and take a look at it in some games. So I did a real quick test of a few games to sort of get a feel for the controller itself and the buttons, and see how it all compares to the Pro controller, or I guess in my case the Joycons, as I don't actually own a Pro controller anymore. So I tried out games like Super Mario Odyssey, which felt really good, and then I tried out a couple of the NES games in the Nintendo Switch Online app. This actually is really good, and using the D-pad for this feels really nice. And of course, I also tried a bit of Mario Maker 2, which I also use a lot of the D-pad for. And then, of course, Splatoon 2. But before I get into Splatoon 2, I actually want to talk a bit about the Nintendo Switch and its input lag and latency. And specifically because this has somewhat of a relevancy to Splatoon 2 in the eyes of the community, and that's mostly because of a site called Are Splatoon 2's Controls Fixed? The main reason why I want to talk about this site is because this site actually paints Splatoon 2 as the problem when it comes to the controller latency and the input delay, when this is in fact not the case, and this is entirely console wide. But here they talk about it's Splatoon 2's fault. And the community for Splatoon 2 often makes this mistake of referring to this input lag or latency as a Splatoon 2 problem, where it is in fact not the case, and this entire problem is in fact console wide. And the reason for this is because of the way that the controllers connect to the Switch. It uses a Bluetooth connection as opposed to on the Wii U, it used a more basic, just sort of Wi-Fi connection, and it sort of results in this input delay. Now, granted, quite a few people probably don't even notice it's a thing. In fact, the input delay is down to very frames, a very small amount of frames as well. And so I did a test of this myself with the SN30 Pro Plus and compared it to the Joy-Cons and the Pro controller's documented input lag to see how it compared to the Nintendo hardware themselves and this third-party controller. My initial tests of the Joy-Con versus SN30's motion controls yielded a result that showed me that around 80 seconds on average for the Joy-Cons to react to the motion controls, and a staggering 66 milliseconds for the SN30 Pro Plus. That's a pretty sizable difference. And for those that are curious, the Pro controller on average has around the same sort of response time as the Joy-Cons at roughly around 85 to 90 milliseconds. So the SN30 having a 66 average is pretty good. But now let's see what it's like for the input delay. different to the motion delay. The input delay yields a little bit of a different result, as the Joy-Con takes roughly around 66 milliseconds to respond to inputs, where the SN30 yields around 49 to 50 milliseconds on average. So even with just inputs, direct inputs, not even motion controls, the SN30 still tops the Joy-Con in comparison. And for those curious, the Pro controller sits around the same response time as the Joy-Cons. So what's all of that like in frames? So comparatively to the Switch Pro controller, it takes around 6 to 7 frames on average for the Pro controller to recognize the inputs, and about the same for the motion controls. Well, testing through watching the footage back frame by frame multiple times shows that the SN30 takes around roughly 5 to 6 frames for the motion controls to acknowledge, and around an average of 6 frames for input. Now, that's actually really good compared to the Pro controller, while this is something that is $20 cheaper. So, on average, it's about the same as the Pro controller's responsiveness, and sometimes even better. So, just on average, it's about the same, but at its minimum, it could be better than the Pro controller itself. So, all in all, is the SN30 Pro Plus worth it? Absolutely. At only $50 US, it is absolutely a great product, and the controller itself is amazing. All the amount of stuff you can do, remapping the controls, using it on more than just the Switch itself, changing the sticks, the trigger, vibration, it's absolutely worth the $50. Is it a replacement for the Pro controller? Well, that's debatable. If you're in it purely for the latency and you want to reduce that as much as possible, the SN30 Pro Plus is probably the way to go. But if you're already someone that has the Pro controller, then it may or may not be worth spending another $50 on a controller. If you have a Pro controller like me that was suffering from stick issues, then it might be worth changing the controller now while you're, considering just getting rid of the Pro controller itself or replacing that. You might as well go with something that is cheaper and is actually much better to use. So I think the controller itself is an all-around better solution to the controls and a better controller over the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. And if you're a huge stickler for that latency, then it might be worth getting this controller simply for that. Or if you're someone that doesn't like the feel of the buttons on the Pro controller itself, these buttons feel much better in comparison, in my opinion. So I definitely say that this product is absolutely worth your time and worth the $50. So if you're interested in picking one up, I will leave a link in the description to the Amazon US page for it, as well as a link to the creator's website so you can look more into it yourself. But all in all, I do recommend this controller. It is absolutely worth it. It is probably the best Switch controller in my opinion. So I want to thank everyone for watching, and that's it.